more information, you can go to WSLR.org for good jazz.
You are listening to WSLR LP 96.5 FM.
Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk About the Middle East. I'm Andy Blanche.
I'm Juliana Musheyev, and John Dickman is here helping us out with the soundboard.
On this show, we talk about the Middle East, its culture, politics, religion, history, just about anything that captures the complexity of the region.
We hope to promote open and honest discussion about the conflict in Israel and Palestine and to humanize the conflict by getting to know people who have a stake in the issues. You're listening to WSLR 96.5 LPFM in Sarasota and WBPV 100.1 LPFM in Bradenton. The opinion and views expressed on Let's Talk About the Middle East are strictly those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect those of the station manager, board of directors, or anyone else affiliated with WSLR. The Venice Blues Festival is happening today at from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m., the third annual Venice Blues Festival at Maxine Barrett Park in Venice, Florida. Enjoy blues music from artists such as The Kinsey Report, Deb and the Dynamics, Larry McRae, Betty Paget, T.C. Carr, Kettle of Fish, and Greg Polos, and more. This is a rain or shine event. To view the full lineup and to get more information, go to veniceblues.com.
Today we'll be interviewing Ayse Kadayifci-Orellana. Ayse was a founding member of the Salam Institute for Peace and Justice in Washington, D.C. This is a group that conducts research, education, and practice related to conflict resolution and nonviolence. Ayse is currently an assistant professor at Georgetown University. She has published numerous book chapters, articles, and a book on religion and conflict resolution, Muslim women's peacebuilding, interfaith dialogue, and nonviolence. Thanks so much for joining us, Ayse.
Thank you very much for having me, Andy.
So let's just jump into it. You are a Muslim woman, originally from Turkey, and now you teach peace studies at Georgetown University. Can you tell us how your life came to take this particular course?
Yes, actually, I never thought of doing conflict resolution. I even didn't know such a field existed. I wanted to do physics, astrophysics in particular, but then I was an exchange student to Australia when I was 17 years old with the Rotary Peace Program. So while I was in Australia, I was asked with all these questions related to Turkey, Middle East conflict, which I had no answers to. So after that experience, I became very interested in understanding how different cultures and communities interact, why conflicts take place, and how could we address that issue. So I changed my focus and studied international relations and then later on conflict resolution. That's how I sort of became interested in this field.
That's fascinating. And your dissertation research was actually on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What led you to choose that topic?
Yes, my dissertation topic was on Islamic interpretations of war and peace in West Bank and Gaza. I had friends and relatives and family friends in both Israel and Palestine, and so I was really because I had familiarity and love for both communities, I was really interested in how do we address this conflict in the region. And the more I start looking into this conflict, I was struck by the role religion played. While I was, I grew up as a Muslim, and religion was part of our life. We were not very sort of conservative. So one of the things that fascinated me was how within each religious tradition, there are different interpretations, different understandings of the same text, same stories and narratives. So, and I also wanted to understand how these narratives were used in the context of Israeli-Palestinian conflict to legitimize the violence. But because I was Muslim and I was more familiar with the tradition, and it would have been so much more difficult to focus on other religions as well, I focused on the role of Islam and why under certain circumstances one particular interpretation becomes accepted by a community and is more politicized. So that's why I sort of was interested in this topic.
So in Western countries, we often think about conflict resolution as leading ultimately to some kind of agreement where both parties sign a contract or a treaty. My understanding is that Islamic peacebuilding has some very different traditions in it. Can you talk a little bit about how they differ?
Yes, of course. I would say that the Islamic tradition of conflict resolution is very close to what we would call conflict transformation in the West, which is sort of a tradition that looks more about healing and restoring relationships. And in the Islamic and Middle Eastern context in general, the conflict resolution approaches emphasize not so much the individual as in the Western tradition that we would do, but the community relations and community harmony. So instead of promoting self-interest, it would look at community interest. And instead of looking at just coming to an agreement, it would look at how do we restore the relationships. And it would involve rituals and mechanisms that would aim to repair the relationships. Also, rather than being only a written text, the verbal part of the agreement is also important in the Islamic context. So there is also the issue of face saving, not embarrassing people, trying to find a way that parties to conflict can come to a place where they could both feel comfortable continuing their relationship with each other is very important as well. So I would say these are some of the key differences between the two.
That's absolutely fascinating. Have you actually participated in those forms of peace building? And how do people react when they're engaged?
It's usually to be a part of that kind of practice, you need to be from that context. Of the third parties in the Middle Eastern context are generally those people who live and will continue to live after the agreement is reached. They're usually religious leaders, or spiritual leaders. It could be both men and women. And I have observed some, but to be a member, in the U.S., because I live in the U.S., I don't necessarily get the chance to do that. But I had a chance of observing that as I work with some people who are called jahads, who are the people who help parties come to find a place to become more peaceful.
It's
usually an emotional process. So.
Yeah, it sounds like it involves emotions as much as the head,
yes.
Which is not very Western.
Hi, Aisha.
Yeah.
There's a perception that Muslims are either terrorists or innocent bystanders, but we both know that there are Muslims that are actively involved in peace building like you are. In one of your articles, you define a Muslim peace builder as someone who adopts the Islamic framework and is inspired by their faith. Can you talk about what you mean by that statement?
Of course. I mean, when we talk about religious peace building, we usually think about religious leaders. But I think there are so many different ways members of religious communities can become part of a peace work, and some of them are inspired their faith, traditions, and values. Some of them, for example, looks at the tradition of the Prophet and his companions in their work as a role model, and so that's how they become inspired. The motivation for what they do is also coming from their faith tradition. So that's what I think I mean by using an Islamic framework, using the values within the Islamic tradition, such as compassion, loving kindness, justice, and social empowerment as mechanisms to bring peace in their communities.
Great. And how are Muslim women involved in peace building?
Yes, actually in the West we always see how Muslim women are usually depicted as victims. But in my experience, there's so many amazing Muslim women who are doing excellent work in contexts as challenging as Somalia, Nigeria, Afghanistan, Iraq. And one of the strengths of the Muslim woman is that they also use and adopt an Islamic framework, which provides them with the legitimacy in their context. Mm-hmm. And so I could cite some examples like Sakina Yakubi from Afghanistan, Asha Agi from Somalia, Hafsat Maina Mohammed, who's actually a colleague and a friend of mine from Nigeria, who has been working in her community against Boko Haram, for example, for a long time.
Great. So speaking of Muslim women, many people think that Islam and feminism are contradictory. They believe that feminism only exists in a secularized society and that Islam embodies these patriarchal structures that perpetuate the oppression of women. But in your article, you point out that the first wave of feminism that was brought about by secular elites was actually offensive to Islamic women because they saw their Islamic values as a safeguard against those oppressive structures. Can you talk about that?
Yes, of course. The first wave of secularism and many other women's movements in the Middle East have sort of tried to, because they saw Islam as the problem, they tried to secularize the societies, which is often associated with making them non-Muslim. And so that there was a quite strong reaction. Also, this had a backlash by the community members who thought anyone who works with a woman is trying to undermine the faith tradition, which created a lot of defensive attitude. Muslim women, on the other hand, usually argue that Islam was a very progressive religion, which came in the 7th century, and the Quran talks to not only men but women as well. It directly talks about men and women, and every message there is for men and women. Also, the Quran gave specific rights in the 7th century that was not heard of at the time, such as right to divorce, right to inheritance, right to decide who a woman is supposed to get married. So when women try to promote their own rights, they go back to the Quran, which seems to be the most legitimate and authentic source to counter patriarchal structures that have nothing to do with religion. And there are also examples of the Prophet, who who is the role model for Muslims. So he had always encouraged women's participation in mosques. Actually, there was a woman imama leading the prayers at his time as well. Women were there's stories about how women were able to stand up against the caliph after the Prophet and then sort of defend their rights, and the caliph would give in and recognize the woman's point. So these are the stories through which Muslim women rethink how their liberties and their rights can be experienced in today's world. So, and one of the challenges, many of the religious leaders and interpretations of the text today are male. So there's an effort to reclaim their religion from these patriarchal traditions.
So, Aisha, let me ask a follow-up question on that one. Clearly, there are women in some Muslim societies that are oppressed by the men in that society. What would you say about that from what you know about Islam and the Quran?
Oh, absolutely. They're anti-Islamic. I mean, if you're, for example, not allowing women to receive her share in, let's say, for inheritance, that is anti-Islamic. If you're not allowing women to work, that is anti-Islamic, because Islamic history, from the time of the Prophet, women played social roles, leadership roles. Like Prophet Aisha was not only a warrior, but an educator, among other things. So what they're doing is not Islamic.
Wow, that's so important that people understand that.
So women would, what we do is usually, in this case, align with religious leaders and women, Muslim women, to based in the Quranic and prophetic tradition, to sort of show that this is non-Islamic. But changing structures and social norms that are is very, very difficult. There are all these political dimensions that are going on. Many of these things that's happening is not because of religion, but it serves the interests of certain people. So we really need to understand the power dynamics and workings of that society so that we actually are able to change and transform those societies.
Great, thank you. The role of the West in peace building in the Middle East is a hotly debated topic. Can you talk about how Western intervention affects the work of Muslims engaged in peace building? And can you comment on how the recent events in Paris affect Muslim peace building as well?
Yes, of course. I think many of the interventions, there are different kinds of interventions in the Muslim world. Some of them are state interventions through military action. Some of them are state interventions through state institutional agencies. And then we have non-governmental organizations of different varieties. I think we have to distinguish them for once. And also, one of the challenges of peace building in another context is when you come as an outsider, first thing is you do not understand the local cultural context and the local dynamics. So you're at a disadvantage. And one of the things that we usually do is we try to apply what we know best. And what we know best may not be the most effective and appropriate mechanism to apply in another context. Secondly, we tend to have, coming from a Western context, see that this is what we know, and this is what we know is the better approach and best approach. So there is a power asymmetry in our sort of imposing what we think is the correct method of approaching the issues, which also creates resentment and also sort of disempowers local communities, which adds to more resentment and defensiveness. At the same time, because we do not understand the local dynamics, cultures, we're not as effective as we do. So it looks like our efforts are serving our own self-interest in the West, so that is creating more resentment. And because we have not succeeded, because we didn't understand the context, we created more havoc, more chaos. So it sort of creates more difficulty. So what happens with the Muslim peace builder communities who try to inform and try to say, we have to do it this way, they're usually not listened to. It makes it very difficult for those organizations and groups who work or who want to work with Western organizations to be seen as traitors. So there is a delicate balance that we need to sort of recognize in that dynamic. And so a lot of good intended people, but what happens is then that we have different organizations doing different things. Rather than working synergetically, we're pulling it in the different directions. So sometimes we at the same undermine each other's work as well, which sort of leads to more chaos.
Can I ask another follow-up question, Ayse?
Sure.
Have you had positive experience with groups from the West? And if so, how did that differ from the kind of situation you've been describing?
Yes, there are also very many positive experiences. So, for example, there are a lot of organizations, and including United States aid agencies, have recognized and start doing a lot of evaluation work, evaluating why are we doing good, what are we not doing good. So there's a lot of reflective thinking that's going on in the peace-building community in the West. So based on that, we are working with new approaches called community-driven or community-based approaches that try to have a more balanced relationship with local communities, and it's more participatory. It is more sort of taking into consideration the community needs and through town hall meetings and other meetings. So those approaches that recognize cultural traditions, local traditions, have been much more successful. So organizations like Mercy Corps, Catholic Relief Services, USAID, they have been sort of working in these areas, and there's so many successful examples. But the challenge is they're not making a huge change in the world and bringing a peaceful world, but they're bringing peace to communities. And we don't get to hear as much of those success stories in the media, and we only hear what is not working. So it creates the impression that nothing good is coming out of it. But it's not true. Actually, there's more good news and more good things happening than the bad news.
That's great. And can you comment on how the recent events in Paris that have gotten, a lot of publicity and have spurred a lot of hatred? Can you comment on how those events affect the efforts in the Muslim world to build peace?
Yes, absolutely. The tragic events in Paris and like other events similar to that happened before definitely creates more fear and more animosity towards the Muslim world. But in fact, this is what the groups like Daesh or ISIS are trying to create. The idea of terrorism is to create fear. And they want also to alienate or create divisions between West or Muslims and non-Muslims. So this is part of their strategy. And so what is happening is that we have to recognize the majority of the people who die because of these acts, not in Paris or in the West, but in the Muslim world, the majority of the victims are Muslims. And so by being depicted as also the terrorists, they're doubly being victimized. They both are the victims of many of the attacks who die and suffer most, and they're also seen as the perpetrator of that sort of thing. So it really is making it very hard for the Muslims. But it also, the media coverage usually does not bring about the stories of positive images of Muslims as well, who are doing something. So it's really making it a difficult situation for Muslims, both in the West and in the Middle East. One thing it's doing is it's sort of forcing Muslims to a place where they either with us or with us. Like if you're Muslim, you're one of them. So it creates the world into black and white, and it doesn't leave space for dialogue and learning from each other. So that's the negative side. Yeah.
Aisha, many people recently have pointed out that the reaction here in the United States to the Paris attacks has far outweighed our reaction to recent attacks that occurred in the Middle East. Can you comment on how that difference in reaction feels to you from a personal perspective?
Yes, I mean, just over the summer, there was an explosion in Turkey that killed more than 100 people. That was also Daesh or ISIS. And so I think what happens is that in the minds of many people in the West, the Middle East is like a war zone. These are almost normalized in the minds of people. But of course, when you're coming from that region, you are enmeshed in your own suffering and your pain, and it hurts when others don't recognize your pain as valid as their own. But I can see that there's a sort of a numbness to the violence that's going on in the Middle East. So if it's in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, we're sort of used to hearing bombing there. But when it is somewhere in the West, whether it's Paris, whether it's New York or United States, it also, it is novel, it is shocking, and it also makes us realize that it hurts us more because we're not safe. It really sort of undermines our feeling secure. Because if it's in the Middle East, we can avoid going there. It's not part of our routine life. But this is our life. This is our symbols. Does that make sense? So when coming from Middle East and living in the West, I can see the both points of view. But also, it makes me so sad to see that we become so numb to conflicts elsewhere, and it seems normal. It's just so sad.
I agree. It is really sad. Hopefully, shows like this may be able to help make a difference. You mentioned your homeland of Turkey, Aisha. Yes. Can you comment on how the Syrian refugees are affecting conditions in Turkey?
Yes, Turkey accepted more than, I think the official number is like approximately 2 million refugees. Here we're debating whether we should accept 10,000 refugees in the next 3 years. Turkey, in the first couple of years of the war, have taken millions, and over 1 million. And each year, like last year, I think there were like, how many Syrian children were born? Some number was given to me around 200,000. I'm not sure if that number is correct, but it's a very it's a very fastly growing population as well. And many of these people used to have perfectly, well-established lives. They had jobs, they had homes, and suddenly they've lost everything. So they're in a very desperate place. So some of these refugees are living in refugee camps, but others are living in different parts of town. So first of all, they're traumatized. Their children are not being able to get educated. Turkish government and refugee agencies trying to address this issue, but it is really overwhelming for Turkey to address this issue on its own. So Turkey has been trying to get support from other international organizations to take some of the burden, at least financially or in other ways. It also has some social consequences with having so many people coming in to a country, because they need jobs, they need work, and so they become a competition with the local communities. They disrupt the local situation. So they're also increasing conflicts between the local community and the refugees, which is really sad. But that is, we have in our conflict resolution field a notion called do no harm. And every good intention that we may have, every good intervention may have some unintended consequences. Yeah. Usually when a refugee group comes into a society, it has these unintended social disruptions. And so Turkey is trying to diffuse that, but it is kind of tense. Turkey had a tense year with the rise of Daesh terrorism, with the Kurdish situation, the elections, etc. So it was a very delicate situation, and I don't know the Syrian refugee issue with the other thing that's happening in Turkey is that many of these refugees are trying to go to Europe through the boats, and many of them end up dying. We saw the images of the children. They were those beaches were in Turkey, unfortunately.
Yeah, really sad situation. Yeah. So Aisha, we're getting close to the end here, so we wanted to finish with one last question. With the backlash against Muslims, especially against the refugees, as you're talking about growing now, we're wondering if you could comment on whether that fear is valid for people here in the States, and what can we do as activists to prevent this kind of intolerance? And you only have a minute to answer this, so it's horrible to give you such an important question, but do what you can.
I will do it. First, fear is natural, but it's not constructive, and that's what the terrorists want. So there are things that we could do. First, we could, as advocates, write to our representative governors to talk about and state how we're unhappy with their decision. I think that's a right that we could use. Also, writing to newspapers for more balanced reporting to not only depict a negative image but emphasize more positive images of Muslims is very important. And to reach out to the Muslims in our community members, going to, and working with organizations, churches, mosques, synagogues that work with these communities to find out what are their needs and try to address them, welcoming to them, hosting them sometimes, I think some people have been doing, or a sort of sometimes just befriending them can make a huge difference. But I think the most important thing is the advocate writing to our representatives, governors, and sort of asking for more balanced approach to this issue.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ayse. It was amazing to hear you speak about peace building in the Muslim world. Is there a way for listeners to reach you or learn more about your work?
Sure. They can contact me at my email. My email is S as in Sam, A as in Apple, O as in Orellana at 32 at Georgetown EDU.
Great.
And Georgetown Conflict Resolution Department's website will have more information about this.
Great. Thank you so much. If you want to learn more about this show, or if you have ideas for topics or speakers, you can find us on Facebook. Just search Let's Talk About the Middle East and leave a comment. Tell us what you want to hear about. Join us next time for an interview with Joel Branold, Director of Alliance for Middle East Peace, which represents over 100 grassroots peace groups in Israel and Palestine. Take care and spread the peace.